welcome to episode 176 of Manage the Wild. I'm Nick Madsen. As we get towards the end of July, this is the time of year that really, for me in wildlife, was difficult. From the end of July all the way into October. As the green up starts burning off and you get into that late summer and that hot weather, and you, in the area that we live in, the Intermountain West, you start losing all of that moisture. The animals start looking for places to find good quality protein, and oftentimes that was in farmers' fields. And so for the next 90 days or so, it was almost every night it felt like that I was out in fields pushing animals away, dealing with those depredation issues. And we would have multiple guys, whether it was biologists or technicians. We were all out in these fields and we were pushing the animals away because they were causing so much problems. I remember one night where we decided we had to go in and kill some elk. They were coming into a pivot, and the pivot was the only one within 20 miles. And these elk were coming off of Forest Service ground, and the Forest Service ground was very difficult to access. They would come immediately off of Forest Service and beat right on this guy's property. And the guy didn't care if they were on the range. That was fine. And it was a 40-acre pivot, and so it was just too much area to fence. And so every few days we would have to come in and we would haze off until the damage got too deep or too bad, and then we would have to come in and do removals. And I remember sitting at the edge of this pivot as the sun set and it started to get dark. And we're sitting there and you got mosquitoes flying all over and you've got ticks crawling across you, and you're just sitting there waiting. And it got dark, and all of a sudden you can just hear the sticks start snapping. You can hear the chirps from the calves and the cows as they're making their way down. And we could hear a whole lot of talking going on from these elk as they got into the field. And I'll never forget that moment when we turned on the spotlight and you just see 200 pairs of eyes staring at you. And then we cut loose and we ended up killing quite a few elk, and they took off running. And after a situation like this, you usually have about a week's relief. Deer, on the other hand, deer, in my opinion, are dumber than a box of rocks when it comes to hazing and removals for depredation, because deer, they just don't care. They'll come back night after night after night. And at the time, the rancher, he only cared about the elk because the elk were the biggest animals, so obviously they have to be eating the most. So we killed a whole bunch of elk, and for the next week there weren't any. But I went back a few days later. The elk still hadn't come down. They were still up in the Forest Service area. And when I was there counting at like 1 or 2 in the morning, I ended up counting close to 200 head of deer. And I asked him if he wanted us to do deer removals as well. And he said, no, the deer aren't the ones causing the problem. It's the elk. And I was like, well, you got 200 head of deer in your alfalfa field. I'm sure they're causing problems. And he said, no, they were fine. So I hazed all the deer out. And then I came back the next day just to check to make sure the elk and the deer had come back. But the other thing that I never even looked at because I was so focused on deer and elk was the amount of jackrabbits. He probably had well over 200 jackrabbits on his property. And when I got talking to him a bit about it, he goes, oh yeah, those things are there day and night. It doesn't matter. They're just constantly in the fields, but they're not doing any damage. And it reminded me of this study that was put out from Utah State where they were doing a study on bison and jackrabbits. And they found out that bison weren't doing as much damage to the fields as the jackrabbits because they were constantly doing coyote removals in that area. And the jackrabbits there was a whole lot of jackrabbits because there was very few predators because they were doing removals. And so it's interesting as you get into these type of situations, the things that people will overlook and what they won't overlook, the things that I overlooked. But this time of year is when depredation becomes challenging. So, if you ever want to see what it's like to work in wildlife, go out at night with a biologist or a technician. Go out there and see how many elk are in the fields. It'll give you a new appreciation for the ag industry and how much they're actually doing in feeding the wildlife. All right, guys, have a great day. Stay wild.